So the final panel is Revitalizing Liberalism. And we saved it for the last because we didn't leave you with a message of gloom and doom. We've had, this is supposed to be a conference about defending liberalism for the 21st century, but of course we got into a lot of difficult, knotty issues with liberalism that we don't have clear answers to. And so I'm hoping we are going to leave you with a more hopeful note. But to introduce the speakers here, we've got Pratap Bhanu Mehta, one of my favorite columnists and political theorists, who has made his mark in India as the most important public intellectual there. And that's not only because he writes brilliantly, he has a column in the Indian Express, but he also writes boldly and honestly. He was a critic of the previous Congress government, and then when the Modi regime and its Hindu nationalism forces took over, despite the personal cost to him, he did not stop shining the light on them. Pratap is also a brilliant political theorist who's written about all kinds of issues, from constitutional law to Adam Smith's Enlightenment. And so I'm very grateful that Pratap is here. And of course, Frank Fukuyama needs no introduction. And I'm not going to go around rattling off his Wikipedia page here. I'll just tell you a little story that, Frank is not just an intellectual superstar, but he combines a great deal of humility with his superstardom. And when we started planning this panel, and the title was Revitalizing Liberalism at the End of History, he wrote to me and he says, I don't want to talk about that backward notion of the end of history. Can we talk about something else? I had to actually sort of talk him into at least saying something about the end of history, because I think it offers us a great analytical framework for understanding our current moment. And so without further ado, Frank and Pratap, take it away.
Thank you, Shikha, and thank you to the entire team and all of you for being here. As you can imagine, this has already turned out to be, as you've seen, a really extraordinary conference. And who better, I think, to sort of end this conference with than a kind of conversation with Francis Fukuyama. What we are going to do in the next hour or so is I'll invite Francis to first make an opening statement about how we might defend, revitalize liberalism in the 21st century. I'll follow that up with remarks for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves. This is going to be a little bit of an exercise in Deweyan improvisation. Partly we left it that way because we wanted to kind of see what others had said, what are some of the things that needed to be put on the table that might not have come up in the conference as well. And partly, I think, in the liberal spirit, we actually agree a lot, so we'll probably have to argue against our own selves at certain moments to make sure that we leave this room before dinner with a reinvigorated sense and much more clarity of what is to be done. To borrow that phrase of Lenin's. So, Francis.
Okay, thank you. Shikha was right that I really didn't want to talk about the end of history. I get asked about this about 3 or 4 times every week for the last 35 years, and so that's quite a lot of conversations on that topic. If Pratap wants to bring it up, I guess I'll have to respond. I do want to make one announcement before we begin. Which concerns me personally. I started a journal called American Purpose to defend liberal values around the world. And as of today, we are merging with Yasha Monk's Persuasion, and we are going to be a part of Persuasion. So hopefully the content and the writers and the community that's been built around American Purpose will work in collaboration with another great defender of liberalism, and one of these days we may even take over UnPopulist. Who knows? So let me just say very quickly why liberalism is good, what some of the critiques have been based on, and why they are off base, and then a little bit about the future, all right? I have to begin with a definition of what I mean by liberalism. I don't think we started the conference with a clear definition. I'm going to tell you mine. Obviously, different people have different understandings of it. In continental Europe, it's a center-right position that's pro-free market, anti-regulation. In the United States, it's a left-of-center position. Sometimes it's confused with libertarianism. I have a pretty simple definition. Liberals believe that all human beings universally have dignity, that they are owed a certain minimal degree of respect, and that there are no subgroups of human beings that have a higher status than other groups. That's a foundational belief. And then the second part of it is more political, that that dignity is protected by institutions, primarily by a rule of law that limits the power of states to impinge on the private freedom of those individuals, by constitutional checks and balances that limit the power of states. If you satisfy those two conditions, then I consider you a liberal regime, and I don't connect it to any particular set of economic policies. So, I spent some time getting to Denmark, and Denmark has a marginal tax rate of something like 55%, very high for an American, but it's still, in my view, a liberal society, as is, let's say, Japan or another country that has a much lower percentage of GDP. I think that what's important is the belief in the human universalism and the existence of law that prevents the abuse of power, right? So that's the basic idea. I think there are three fundamental reasons why we should all be liberals, and why liberalism has been as successful as many people have pointed out in the course of this conference. The first one is just a practical reason. It is a way of governing diverse societies. And every society in the world today is diverse, much more diverse than it was 50 years ago, certainly 100, 200 years ago. The origin of liberalism in the 17th century was against the backdrop of the European wars of religion that arose out of the Protestant Reformation. Europeans spent 150 years killing each other. Something like a third of the population of Germany died as a result of the 30 Years' War. And at the end of that, early liberals got together and said, actually, we should not make the goal of society pursuit of a single final end of human beings as defined by a particular religious doctrine, because there will never be peace. What we need to do is lower the horizon of politics and say that everybody can pursue the religion they want, but they need to tolerate people of other religions. And this has been the fundamental practical reason why, for example, I believe in a society as diverse as India, I don't see how you can govern it in anything other than a liberal fashion, given the religious, caste, ethnic, regional diversity of a place like that. Similarly for virtually every other country in the world. In the 19th century, the threat became less religion than nationalism, or very aggressive forms of nationalism that wanted expansionist foreign policies that again led to a series of very, very bloody wars in the 20th century. And at the end, you had the birth of liberal institutions that again allowed people of different ethnicities, races, with different national histories to live under a liberal framework. Okay, so that's reason one. The second reason is a moral one. At the core of liberalism is human freedom and human autonomy. This is the, and so if you ask yourself what makes all human beings equal, it has to be something like their capacity for moral choice, because they're different skin colors, genders, ethnicities, and so forth. But what human beings share is the capacity to choose between right and wrong. If you go back to the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve disobey God's order not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They do it anyway. They're cast out of the garden. And I think it's very symbolic of this kind of intermediate moral status that the book of Genesis celebrates. Human beings are not angels. They do not make the right decision all the time, but they're capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. And that is what is protected, that autonomy, that moral autonomy to make these kinds of decisions. And that is something that is shared by human beings all across the world. Final reason is economic. Liberals like to protect things like property rights, the right to engage in commerce, and for that reason, liberal societies throughout history have been the richest societies in the world. You look at early liberal societies like the Netherlands and England, they really led the commercial revolution. England led the industrial one, and then were joined by the United States, a Germany that was not democratic but was liberal, and these kinds of societies have really made possible the sort of wealthy modern world that we enjoy today. China is not by any means a liberal society, but after Deng Xiaoping's opening in 1978, they basically liberalized their economy, and all of the growth that happened, this miracle of this large country growing at double-digit rates for 30 years would not have been possible without a degree of economic freedom, quasi-property rights, and so forth. And so that is a really good argument for liberal. And by the way, the last panel, nobody mentioned the fact that the rise of India and China was made possible by this liberal international order. I would say that, whatever it is, 2.5 billion people, getting out of poverty, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good accomplishment, right? Okay, so that's reason number 3, why it is still desirable to have a liberal society. So in my view, part of the reason that there is so much opposition on both the left and the right to liberalism, or to the idea of liberalism, is that it has undergone 2 big distortions, which I might label, on the one hand, neoliberalism, and on the other hand, what you might call woke liberalism. So let me deal with these, because I do not think that these actually represent what I regard as core classical liberalism. So the neoliberalism, some people just associate it with capitalism per se. I think that's wrong. You cannot have a modern, wealthy society without markets and property rights and freedom to transact. What neoliberalism was a kind of extension of this belief in the market, but also a demonization of the state. And I think that it simply went too far, because you really cannot have capitalist markets if you do not have a strong and capable state that is capable of enforcing property rights, adjudicating disputes, basically keeping peace and security. That's why there's not a lot of economic growth, in a place like Iraq or Syria or other lawless places, right? So that's taken for granted. But I think what began in the 1970s and 80s was an extension of this belief in the market and a pullback of the state that in many cases was quite disastrous. We saw the first fruits of that in the privatizations and this very chaotic transition that the former Soviet world tried to make to capitalist democracy in the 1990s, in the absence of a state that could actually oversee that process under something like a rule of law. And then it came back to bite us in the ass in the 2008 crisis, because we had exported, this doctrine about capital markets being self-regulating to the rest of the world. Turned out they weren't. You had a cascading series of economic crises that ultimately led to the subprime crisis in 2008. And that, I think, was just an ideological deviation, where we simply did not understand that interpretation of economic liberalism simply did not work. Now, the deviation on the left is what just you might call woke liberalism, and that is the association of liberalism with a certain set of social, a certain kind of social liberalism, largely revolving around civil rights related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. And it is my belief that these, the extent to which you recognize these kinds of social rights, in many cases, that actually debatable in a liberal society, that some of them have social costs and, are not accepted by everybody, particularly in view of its integration into a certain form of identity politics. And I believe that identity politics can actually take two forms. One of it is a perfectly acceptable liberal form where you say this particular group that just by virtue of membership in that group is marginalized simply for their skin color, their gender, and whatever. And what we want to do is use that common identity to organize, to mobilize, and to force the democratic political system to include us in the same rights that are enjoyed by everyone else. That's the kind of Martin Luther King civil rights movement. That's the understanding of identity politics that I think is completely liberal and, in fact, necessary in a democratic society. The illiberal form is the one that says that these identity categories are actually essential, that the most important thing you're going to know about a person is their race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and so forth. And these are fixed categories that we do not accept voluntarily. They're simply given to us by birth. And that contradicts that first principle that I said was my definition of what it meant to be a liberal, that is human universalism. And I think it actually sets up the ground. I mean, it kind of joins hands with nationalism at a certain level if you're going to make distinctions of this sort between different human groups. And I think that what's happened in the world in the last few years is that the left and the right have taken one of these forms of, a distortion of liberalism and said, that's liberalism, right? So a lot of young people, especially following the economic travails, the financial crisis, growing inequality, have said, liberalism is responsible for economic, socioeconomic injustice. And I think that historically there's no basis for saying that. You can be a liberal society, but if you're also a social democracy, you will redistribute wealth and income, and you will mitigate some of those economic inequalities. And I think the problem was really the neoliberal interpretation that allowed, this kind of global capitalism, very ruthless kind of global capitalism to take root. And the woke form of capitalism has also, apart from challenging the fundamental premise of human equality, I think has also led to its own forms of intolerance and illiberalism in terms of, freedom of speech on campus, cancellation, all these things that we're quite familiar with. And again, a lot of people on the right will say, well, that's the essence of liberalism. It leads to this disintegration of society on, these different identity categories, and therefore it's bad. And I think that both of these different forms of what I would say is really not liberalism at all, or not core liberalism, need to be walked back. And we need to get back to a more limited and moderate understanding of what a liberal society is. Now, we had said that we should say something positive at the end of this very nice conference about liberalism, and maybe it would be good to do a little bit of a historical review, particularly of the United States and its founding principles, because it's very common critique to say that the United States claims it's a Lockean liberal society, but it's really not. We have racism, we have sexism, we have patriarchy, we have economic injustice, and liberalism is not living up to its its aspirations or its pretensions. That is absolutely true. But it does seem to me that that's kind of asking the wrong question, because it doesn't put things in a historical context. And I actually believe that there's such a thing as progress in history. I do believe that there's a meta-narrative about the way that societies, human societies around the world, develop institutions and then change normative attitudes in response to the evolution of those institutions. And I think that there are a couple different ways of, thinking about, let's say, national identity in America. And by the way, I agree very much with Steve Fish and others that have said that it's very important for liberals to recapture that sense of nation and the fact that we belong. I can defend this at greater length if you want, but I think it's very important for them to recapture that. So, a common critique on the left of the United States is country's completely hypocritical, that it begins with the Declaration of Independence saying that all men are created equal, but first of all, doesn't include women, didn't include black people, didn't include white men without property. All of that is absolutely true. But I think that our particular journey in the United States has been the steady expansion. So we accepted the fact you got a constitutional order, all individuals are equal, but who is a human being? Who is a rights-bearing human being? And that's what was restricted, right? So it was the people that had the vote is this very restricted group of white, wealthy men. So the property restriction is taken away by most states in the 1820s. The Civil War kills 600,000 Americans, but it brings about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Very shamefully, the equality that is promised to all people born in the territory of the United States is not fulfilled. It's fulfilled briefly for a few years after the Civil War, then it's progressively taken away as the southern states are reincorporated into the United States, and that promise is really not fulfilled, at least on a juridical level, until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. It's way too long. It's a terrible story that it took that long to actually fulfill the promise of that extremely bloody war, but it happened, right? And I guess it relates to my own personal experience. I mean, having come from an immigrant Japanese family that came in about 1905, my relatives were all put in camps during World War II. And so they all had to sit out, the war in a little cabin in Colorado. So they were treated, very, very unfairly. But after the war, I think they realized the promise that was there in the civil rights movement. They got back their property and they got their citizenship. Of course, my grandfather then voted for Goldwater. My father was a real liberal and he never forgave my grandfather for that. But, he got his citizenship, and in fact, in the Reagan administration, they actually got restitution for that imprisonment. But I think it kind of indicates, if you think of other societies in the world, at the time of the American founding, how many societies treated people equally on a gender, racial, ethnic, class basis, right? How many societies lived up to those kinds of ideals at that point, 250 years ago? The answer is nobody did. And who is it that has been leading this very, very slow progress towards a more equal future? I think it is liberal societies. Some wanted to leapfrog that process by having a Bolshevik revolution or a Maoist revolution, and they paid a big price for having done that. So I think that if we think about our society, there's a lot to be proud of in terms of this historical narrative of progress. And I think that it's an uncompleted story, but this is something that ought to, I'll just say a little bit about the end of history because it's relevant to this, it's relevant to this issue. Many people read the title of my book but they didn't actually read the book. And if you actually, especially if you read the last 5 chapters, the full title of the book is The End of History and the Last Man. The last man part comes from the philosopher Nietzsche, who said that the last man is the creature who emerges at the end of history, when you have achieved this peaceful, stable, prosperous, liberal society. You create a human being that has no aspirations because their material needs are satisfied, they're not in physical danger, all they do is close in on themselves, they take care of themselves, their families, and they have no higher ideals. And, the basic argument is that human beings have a third part of their psychology, which, the Greeks called thumos. This is pride or spiritedness, or the desire to be recognized for, outstanding virtue. Everybody wants a basic human recognition of their dignity, and that's really the kind of equality that a liberal society gives you by giving you rights as a citizen. But there's also this side of human beings that wants superior recognition, and it could go very bad, and it could go for very good things. And I think that one of the reasons that there's a lot of discontent, I look around at all the encampments on campuses, I think that there's this striving for social justice in a lot of students who are actually well-fed, well-protected, they've gotten good educations, but what's missing is that struggle, the sense of struggle for something higher and better. And that's one of the things that liberal societies actually haven't been all that good at producing. Because they're successful liberal societies. And so I think what we need is a sense of commitment to higher ideals, which in a liberal society have to be liberal. They have to be ones of citizenship, of participation. When Tocqueville talked about the freedom that existed in the United States, he did not mean that in a libertarian sense. He didn't say, oh, we want to make sure the government doesn't, bother us about smoking or, drugs or stuff like that. What he meant by freedom was the freedom to be self-governing, which meant participation in a democratic community to collectively make the most important political decisions affecting the community as a whole. And I think that if there's going to be a rededication to that understanding of what it means to be a free person, not just that the government leaves you alone, but you actively use your agency to work together with fellow citizens to make your society better. That, I think, is the deepest and much more satisfying understanding of what it means to be a citizen and what it means to be a human being. And I think that, in a way, that's kind of the ideal that I think a group like this, could usefully dedicate itself to, is how to shape young people into this understanding of citizenship. So I'll stop there.
Well, it's tough to... it's difficult to say anything after that. That should be the last word and also the last laugh, but we have time. So let me introduce a couple of historiographical notes into this discussion, building on kind of Frank's history in a sense. And I want to, I think, begin by making 3 historical points that might help us diagnose this moment and this crisis of liberalism in its specificity. So the first point I want to make, which is a kind of very obvious one, but in some ways has, I think, been missing in discussions of the crisis of liberalism, which is, if there is a crisis of liberalism at this moment in the 21st century, it is also coming at a moment where there is a crisis of every other system as well, right? The Chinese party state, I mean, I'm not saying it's going to collapse, it is a very enduring political form, but it is experiencing a kind of legitimation crisis of its own. I mean, the degree of repression you need to, or closure you need to apply is an indication of that. It is facing an economic crisis. Other ideological systems, right? The prospect of a kind of modern Islamic constitutionalism. So one, I think, thing to think about as we think about this crisis of liberalism, which is there a kind of global governance crisis that is actually simultaneously affecting lots of different systems of legitimation that got institutionalized over the last 30 or 40 years? And in some senses, this might be actually good news for liberalism, in the sense that liberalism has the capacity for self-renewal in a way in which its competitors might not, right? But I think it is important to kind of, underscore this fact that it's not just liberalism in crisis. It is almost, every kind of ideological system. We just don't have the kind of coherent framework that provides that automatic legitimation that we took for granted for the last 20 or 30 years. And I think it's worth reflecting, and because what that leads us to think about is whether the crisis of liberalism can simply be read as a kind of morality play. Okay, there's liberals and there's anti-liberals. We are the party of virtue, they are the party of vice. I think that story, that dramaturgy of this crisis as a kind of morality play between liberalism and anti-liberalism is actually not going to work. It's not going to work because that presentation is not going to address the deeper material crises out of which this crisis of legitimation is emerging. It's also not going to work, for the following reason. I think it came up in one of the panels yesterday, which is there is a perception out there that the liberal script is still defensible ideologically for all the reasons that Francis just kind of outlined very powerfully, right? But there is an immense social backlash against what people think of as liberal elites and liberal actors. Somebody once said, the liberal script is fine. We just don't like the liberal directors, we don't like the liberal actors, we don't like the liberal producers. You guys are liars, hypocrites, warmongers, elitists. You have turned to oligarchy. You believe in truth, but you have, in a sense, denuded the power of truth-producing institutions. And if that's the critique, then the political task is not going to be yet another philosophical defense of liberalism. I think that in some senses, it's essential, but not really the core of where we are at. So that's, I think, one kind of historiographical point generally about the nature of this crisis. I think the second historiographical point is really how we tell the global history of liberalism over the last 200 to 300 years. I think there is a tendency, and I think it's come up in this conference as well, to sort of naturalize liberalism as part of the history of the West, right? That somehow Europe and America are the natural sites of liberalism in some ways. Yes, liberalism was always imperfectly realized, those ideals were betrayed, these are also the sites of colonialism, slavery, sexism, racism, all of that stuff. But still, there is that kind of Hegelian residue that in some senses it is Western Europe and North America that actually produces the ideological conditions, the philosophical ideas that make liberalism in some senses possible, right? Now, I think it's going to be very important if you're going to reinvigorate liberalism in the 21st century to actually do this as a global history of liberalism. And by that, I mean two things. One, denaturalizing America and Europe as the sites of liberalism. So you could tell a pretty cynical history of the last 200 years, right? Universal suffrage in the United States, in effective terms, comes to being after India and Sri Lanka, right? Switzerland doesn't get universal suffrage till 1973, right? Okay. The number of years where almost all the attributes of a liberal regime that we value, right? Entrenchment of individual rights, political equality, the exercise of political agency by citizens through democratic means, and practices of justification. Count any Western democracy. How many years have actually these practices been institutionalized as a package? It was not, Mark Mazower once wrote, I think, a brilliant book. The title was brilliant, The Dark Continent, right? And the argument was, in some senses, it's not at all obvious that liberalism and liberal democracy, this package, would have won in Europe. So only this kind of post World War II settlement after that extraordinary catastrophe, right? That you actually got a kind of breathing space in which we come to think of liberalism and liberal democracy, that package, as kind of natural to the history of Europe and America. And I think it's important to see that because I think it also then will prevent a kind of condescension towards the rest of the world. As if somehow these were these natural sites of Hegelian self-fulfillment, the real is rational, and the rest of the world is in a sense kind of stuck in this sort of, stasis of history, right? So you do have to have a kind of history of global that denaturalizes Europe and America. It also means a kind of more Machiavellian reading of the history of liberalism. And by Machiavellian, I mean the following, in the sense in which John Pocock used it in the Machiavellian moment, that liberal polities are extremely fragile, rare, snatched through moments of incredible struggle, often through violence and conflict, right? There is no natural teleology to them, and they can as easily be broken. So I think we need to tell a kind of different kind of history for us to actually think of what that historical task is. But the flip side of a kind of global history of liberalism is to also think of the ways in which the rest of the world participates in creating a global liberal order. Just to take the last panel as an example, India's position is now very different, but one of the things when we think of an international liberal order, when we think of the 1945 settlement, 1948 settlement, to present it as a settlement of a kind of Western European order, which oddly enough, even defenders of that order often present it, including my close friend John Eikenberry sometimes, I think slips into that narrative, is just a colossal misreading of that history. That order came out of incredible struggles for decolonization around the world, right? The signing on to the UN HDR by so many countries and the shaping of it, including on women's rights in some senses. Names like Hansa Mehta or Vijay Lakshmi Bhattit will be obscure to you. But those were the Indian delegates at those meetings, right? Arguing for women's rights and taking an anti-apartheid position. Even humanitarian intervention, right? One of the few successful examples of humanitarian intervention, it was aligned with self-interest, was actually India 1971 in the Bangladesh war, preventing genocide. So I think it is actually important that this history now become a genuinely global history in every sense of the term. And I think one of the things that worries me, I think one of the reasons I think liberalism excites a kind of lot of skepticism is because it has come to still be associated with a kind of Hegelian parochialism that keeps kind of, in some senses, cropping up in different ways. So to take the conversation forward, let me just sort of draw out a couple of points you made and sort of ask you to elaborate on them a bit. And let me begin with one historiographical point, just as a kind of example of a certain kind of parochialism in liberal historiography. So you rightly said absolutely that one of the core values of liberalism is political equality and equality of all human beings, right? But you also associated the equality of all human beings with a capacity for moral choice. Now, one of the things we know from the historiography of liberalism is that the invocation of the term capacity was itself used to institute and create hierarchies. Yeah. Ambedkar, the greatest Indian liberal, was once asked to say, how do you ground the idea of equality? And he said, if you have to ask that question, you're probably not interested in equality. It just has to be a kind of practice of the way in which you treat actually other, in some senses, other human beings. And so one question to you, in a sense, is when you think of making this argument for, in a sense, political equality in the way in which you have, right? Is the cogency of that argument going to turn on thinking of what these foundational philosophical premises are? Or is the crisis that so many peoples around the world or within societies they live in still feel that the practices the way liberals treat others, do not express equality. I mean, in a sense, is it a problem of practice, or do we actually need more deeper or newer philosophical foundations for this?
Well, I must honestly say I don't know the answer to that. I would think that you'd need both the theoretical grounding, but also the practice to justify. But what you said about the global, that this shouldn't be grounded simply in a Western experience, I think is very right. And this gets me back to something that I thought was missing in yesterday's discussion about whether liberalism is culturally a Western invention and possession and can only take root in Western societies. My view about this is actually quite Hegelian in the sense that I think that liberalism as a doctrine and as a way of life is historically contingent. Europe was not liberal in 200, 300 years ago. Most of the world was not liberal. It came at a certain historical juncture for different kinds of reasons, but once the practice was established, it turns out that a lot of societies found it very useful. And I would say that my answer to the charge that this is simply a Western practice is to look everywhere around the world. Today, you've got this sociological division as to who votes for liberal parties and who votes for populist parties. And it's actually very highly correlated with modernization and urbanization, population density. So in every country, including India, Hungary, even Russia, if you go to the big cities, people are much more liberal because that's where more educated, people live. They have more opportunities. Those places are more diverse. So in their personal lives, they have to deal with people that are very different from them. And experience with diversity actually does make you more liberal. Somebody was noting that Poland is, the people in Poland that are most anti-immigrant are ones that actually never met an immigrant. They're just worried about the fear of that. But the actual experience of living in a diverse society, I think, teaches you that, something like liberal tolerance is really necessary for you to get along, for your children to get along, and so forth. And that's almost a universal discovery that it kind of grows naturally from a process in which people are increasingly living in large cities with diverse populations, with many more opportunities that allow them to assume many different kinds of identities. This is the old Gesellschaft, Gemeinschaft, distinction. Once you move from the little village, all of a sudden you're confronted with all of these different possibilities. And I think that makes you more open to, the sorts of liberal thinking that we're, and that's not culturally determined. I mean, that's pretty, universal.
Can I push you on that a bit? Because I think this is actually an important, and maybe register two kind of disagreements with it. One, actually, at least in the Indian case, it's actually not true that actually rural India is in a sense less liberal in voting patterns than urban India. In fact, the opposite is the case in some ways, right? And that has to do with, that older law which used to be said, no middle class, no nationalism. And if you think that the yearning for a certain kind of exclusionary nationalism is also the product of a certain kind of middle class, a urbanization, that have in some senses gone hand in hand, that the very societies, the very forms of urbanization, industrialization, dealing with strangers, also those societies also produce the most horrendous form of collectivism in the 20th century, right? So how do we square these two stories?
Yeah, so it's true. So that was Ernest Gellner's theory about nationalism, right? That when you industrialize, you rip people out of their village identities. They don't know who they are, and they need to be told, I'm a German, or I'm, Russian, or whatever. So that's true, but it's also, and that's where I think actually the experience of actual leadership and political organization makes, a big difference, because that same loss of traditional identity can be turned in a liberal direction or it can be turned in a nationalist direction. The history of Europe is really a contest between these two strands. Unfortunately, the nationalist side won, but then people's actual experience of living in these aggressive nationalist societies was pretty horrendous, and they picked the other. But it still remains the case that in many places it is the more cosmopolitan regions that tend to produce liberal politicians.
Right. So, kind of just building on that, one of the things you've also written very powerfully about, and you've made this point about, in a sense, having capable states. Mm-hmm. And there are two critiques of the states competing at the moment, right? There's the kind of right-wing critique of the state, which is that, and this is assuming liberal democracies which are functioning states, that the main challenge that gets in the way of economic growth and prosperity is overregulation. Right? In some sense, that's the kind of right critique of the state.
Yeah.
Right? And then there's the left critique of the state, which is that the principal obstacle is, in a sense, underinvestment in the state. Mm-hmm. Right? For a liberal in 2024, how would you, in a sense, adjudicate between these two critiques? I mean, if liberalism is going to be politically salvaged, because that's the way in which the left-right distinction has been historically configured, and you yourself have kind of, given a powerful critique of neoliberalism in some ways. What do each of these critiques get right? What is right about the right-wing critique, and what might be right about the left-wing critique?
Well, I hate to give these kind of both sides arguments, but they both have elements of correctness. One of the big issues that I have been wrestling with in the last few years has to do with infrastructure, because I actually think that societies need to build stuff. Like right now we're facing this climate crisis, and you got to build transmission lines and wind farms and solar farms and the like, and you can't do it because there are too damn many rules. And so the kind of right-wing critique is clearly right in that respect, that liberals really like procedures, and they tend to pile procedure on top of procedure in search of legitimacy, but then that doesn't allow them to get to outcomes, which is really what people want. And I think that's a big, problem. The other critique, is a complicated one, because clearly concentrated state power can be used for very, very bad purposes. And that's why you want checks and balances and limitations on states. And it really depends on who's running the state and for what purposes. And that is a political issue that, whose outcome you cannot predict in advance. But the one thing I do know is that without that fundamental capacity, you're not going to get, an outcome good or bad. I mean, you're simply going to get, I think, underdevelopment.
And why do you think that argument around the nature of the state has become so polarized in these extreme positions? Because you would have thought, right, that that's an area that might be amenable not just to kind of compromise, but in some senses the discovery of a kind of the appropriate form of regulation, or the kind of the sweet spot where the state should be. India has the kind of same parallel. We kind of lurch in a sense between this sort of total skepticism of the state versus an overinvestment in state capacity. Intellectually and politically, why has that conversation become so difficult? And I say intellectually as well, because I think even amongst our kind of colleagues in social sciences, at least ones who write publicly, you see, in a sense, this kind of verging towards the extremes.
Well, I can't speak to the Indian experience. I do think that there's an aspect of American political culture that has made this very polarizing. This is the thing I learned from Marty Lipset many years ago in his writing on American exceptionalism, that one of the deepest characteristics of American politics is anti-statism, which comes out of the particular American experience. And I think that it is carried to a point where it becomes utterly, self-undermining. That you don't trust the state, Therefore, you don't give it enough resources, you don't send your best people to work on it, and then it doesn't do the job that it's supposed to do. And then people say, well, look, government can't do anything. And that, by the way, is true of a lot of other societies, like in Latin America. You have exactly that same kind of pathology. So there aren't that many countries that actually get that balance right. I think in Northeast Asia, in Japan and Korea, and in most of Europe, they've actually had a different experience with the state where it's regarded as a more positive protector of public interest, and therefore I think they've had an easier time at finding the right balance. But I think in the United States, it's just been very difficult.
So we're going to talk a bit more about your kind of critique of neoliberalism, because I think that's really important, and in a way, it's allowed liberalism to be defined by its critics. Right? Now, there's one reading of neoliberalism, which is that neoliberalism was itself a response to a previous economic crisis, right? The stagflation of the 1970s that created the conditions for neoliberalism to work. And I also completely agree with you that I think in North American histories of neoliberalism, by that I mean roughly the period 1991 to 2009. 1991, Shanghai Stock Exchange just reopened after 100 years, India's liberalization started. It is still the case that this 20-year period is the most significant period of convergence in economic growth in the world and the reduction of intra-country inequality. I mean, it's an astonishing fact about that 20-year period. In that sense, I think, standard histories of neoliberalism coming out of America, I think, just ignore the rest of the world. Having said that, right, that period also produces its own, in a sense, dead end. The dead end that San Moing talked about. Intra-country inequality increases radically. There is a sense that neoliberalism is an ideological project. There used to be an older term for it called hypercapitalism. I mean, all the critiques that we are making of neoliberalism, the 60s and 70s had made them, in a sense, much more powerfully, right? All that solid melts into air. It is in the nature of capitalist relations that it'll eventually undermine almost all other kinds of stability in institutions, right? And it's also led us down to a path where there are two other crises staring at us. To me, the most interesting statistic about American politics is the claim that 60% of Americans now believe that their children will earn less than they did, right? India is experiencing great stagnation despite high growth. And it's an open question how much China can grow. So the question for you is, in a sense, that liberalism has always depended on a certain kind of optimism about growth, right? The future will be better than the past. There's a sense of futurity to it in some ways. Are we in a deeper crisis where that confidence is actually waning across the world? And layer on top of that, the crisis, the climate crisis and the crisis of the Anthropocene in some ways, right? What would a liberalism look like that cannot as confidently take for granted, right? That sense of trajectory of kind of economic growth that more or less we've been accustomed to since World War II, or certainly since 1991.
So I always run into this argument, especially talking about issues like climate. So somebody says, well, what's liberalism going to do about climate? Well, what's any system going to do about climate? Exactly. Right? I don't think that if there is a general slowdown in productivity growth, that this is something that is going to be unique to liberal societies. And in fact, I would think that liberal societies, because they are liberal, are more likely to come up with the kinds of innovations that would be necessary to sustain, growing productivity. And I think that, the historical record of the last, say 150 years kind of indicates that liberal societies are able to adjust. I really think this economic problem is in a way, the lesser of the big problems that we face, because, we've had this pendulum swing between more state intervention in the interest of more equality, social stability, and then times when the pendulum swung back. So very liberal in the late 19th century, and then you get the big crisis in 1907 that leads to the foundation of the Federal Reserve, and then the Great Depression that creates all these new institutions. And I just think that we're in the midst of a pendulum swing. We never get the pendulum to just kind of rest in the middle. It always goes a little bit too far. But this has been going on for a long time, and I don't see any reason why you're not going to continue to make these adjustments. I mean, if you think about what the Biden administration has done to neoliberalism, it's destroyed it. Industrial policy, protectionism, they're all back in a big way. And I think that in a way it's easier to fix those kinds of worries about economic growth than it is on the other side, fixing this expansion of people's understanding of what the realm of individual autonomy ought to be. It's much easier, in other words, it's much easier to say, yeah, we should regulate tech, we should do antitrust, we should not go for free trade deals with quite the enthusiasm. That's relatively easy to do politically. What's harder to do is readjust people's sense of their individual rights and say, well, maybe we need to scale those back.
But isn't the current kind of critique of neoliberalism and the turn that the Biden administration has taken, while eminently understandable and defensible in some respects, does it not also risk creating a world of more zero-sum conflicts? Because the nice thing about that neoliberal illusion, right, 1991 to 2009 was, in a sense, that you could think of a global geopolitical order where there were, at least on economics, less zero-sum conflicts.
Yeah.
Is one of the conditions or one of the ways in which the Biden kind of program is kind of sold domestically, and the rest of the world worries about this, is it is being sold as a project of American primacy. And in the late 20th century, in the beginning of the 21st century, any project that describes itself as a project to reestablish primacy, however motivating and energizing it might be, runs exactly that risk of liberal parochialism that got us conflicts in the 19th and 20th centuries. How do we reconcile this tension?
I'm not so sure that the primacy argument was that critical. It seems to me that the general proposition that you can't sustain liberal democracy without economic growth is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Because people will tolerate, a market economy produces inequality. You can mitigate it through social policy and social protections and so forth, but you're going to have this fundamental inequality that will probably grow, over time. And the only way that you can make democratic publics not revolt against that system as a whole is by having, what they call shared growth. It may not be equal growth, but, people's living standards are increasing. And I disagree that it was only in this brief period in the 90s and the early 2000s that was true. If you look back over the last 200 years, growth has been happening globally at that's the hockey stick that someone referred to earlier, where all of a sudden productivity growth can be counted on. And you're absolutely right. If that stops, then we're back in a zero-sum world where the only way you can get rich is by taking something from somebody else. And that's going to be a disaster. You can't have a democracy, a liberal democracy, under those conditions. So we have to hope that, but look at what's going on now with the kind of new technologies that are coming online. I'm not really convinced that we're in this back in this Malthusian situation where, you can only get rich at somebody else's expense.
Okay, so good. let me turn to the other part of your critique, which is sort of your worry about wokeness. And you said something interesting, that you actually think that's a harder critique in some senses for liberals to handle than the critique of neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. And I want to draw you out on that and ask why. Because one story about that, whatever this woke culture is, right, is one of the aspirations modernity unleashes is the aspiration to individual autonomy. And part of the aspiration to individual autonomy is the power of self-definition, right? I mean, it's one of the kind of achievements of modernity in some way. And it is inevitable, right, in some ways, that that aspiration to self-definition will lead to circumstances and situations where individuals will assert the right to define themselves and will be refused to be defined by objectivist categories. So isn't that wokeness on that interpretation just an outgrowth of liberalism? I mean, it's an inevitable consequences and a realization of one of its core values?
Yeah, that is the argument that Patrick Deneen and a lot of post-liberal critics make, is that this expanding realm of autonomy it's just a one-way street and there's no way of rolling it back. I think that this is an empirical question that I don't think I could definitively answer, but I do think that one of the big obstacles to an ever-expanding realm of individual autonomy is actually human nature. You know, that at a certain point, I mean, we're hitting right up against this in the whole transgender movement, because there are a number of people that would say gender is completely voluntary. That's part of human autonomy. You can decide what gender you're going to be. In fact, you know, this new German law, you can kind of change it once a year if you want. I mean, don't have to have doctor's permission or anything. And I just think it's not going to work. I think that you're already seeing a lot of evidence that, you know, policies based on this assumption that gender is purely an autonomous individual decision leads to, you know, bad outcomes. I would just give you one other little example. Alexander Stilla, who's your Italian journalist, wrote this very nice book a year or so ago called The Sullivanians. So this amazing thing, I had no idea that this movement existed, but it was a cult in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. They were all very much on the left, and the people that set it up believed that the reason that communism never succeeded was because of the nuclear family. Yeah. I mean, this was actually a fairly common left-wing belief that you couldn't actually implement communism as long as the family was there. And so they acted on these beliefs, and they raised their children communally. They took young babies away from their mothers and gave them to somebody else to raise, you know, as a kind of commune. And to read it, you know, today you'd say, you know, these people, I mean, first of all, the doctor that was running this whole thing would be accused of basically rape and sexual abuse because he believed that all men should have access to all women. You know, this was a common belief earlier in the 20th century, and nobody believes that stuff anymore because it's kind of run into this, you know, the fact that there is such a thing as human nature, that parents do have a natural love for their children, and it's not simply an ideological outgrowth of capitalism that says that I'm going to take care of my kid, you know, and give my kid priority over, you know, a stranger's kid. And so I do think that there are certain limits to human autonomy that, and technology has, by the way, affected this very greatly, because you couldn't, in previous years, you couldn't have done the hormone treatments and all this other stuff. But I don't think it's actually going to negate the fact that we are embodied. We are not free-floating wills that can just decide to do anything we want. We actually live in human bodies, in human societies with certain, you know, natural limitations.
But if that, I mean, I agree with that story, and of course that kind of attack on the family goes back. I mean, you know, even during the French Revolution, right?
Yeah.
You know, in the Jacobin tradition, the family was considered the obstacle to the revolution. But if that story is right, which is that there are kind of limits that we will, in some sense, discover, then the kind of political attention to wokeness seems way disproportionate
Yeah.
to both its actual effects and, and perhaps its enduring power.
Yeah, well, maybe so. So I'm contradicting myself now. So maybe it is the case that you're already living through a kind of pendulum swing against wokeness, and that a lot of the current concerns of conservatives actually are way overblown. And that's perfectly possible. But I do think that in the area of where people believe that they've got fundamental rights, it is just it's a harder ask to walk that back than to simply say, well, there ought to be a little bit more regulation or.
Right. So we are coming to the end of the time. So I want to kind of end with one sort of large question, and it goes back again to your definition of your liberalism. So when we think of liberalism, we think of individual dignity, freedom and equality of all persons, checks and balances, entrenchment of individual rights. But historically, one of the great aspirations of modernity, and even the communists have tapped into this aspiration, is the aspiration to kind of create a social world that is a product of our self-conscious choice, right? That empowers us as agents, both individually in our lives, but also in the kind of circumstances that we in some senses inhabit, right? Now, one of the criticisms of liberalism historically has been that liberalism has always maintained a very uneasy relationship with this aspiration and with democracy in particular, right? And that uneasy relationship is still reflected in the way in which we talk about ordinary citizens wanting to exercise their democratic capacities. I just random count, I think even in this day and a half, I counted about 14 to 15 references, which would have phrases like, and understandable in the context, voters would not understand, voters do not care, right? And one diagnosis of this moment is that there is a kind of crisis of democracy in the sense that nominally our procedures are all fair, free and equal elections and so forth. And yet so many sections of society feel incredibly disempowered. And that disempowerment actually produces a deeper form of resentment because now they can't even call it unfair, right? Well, you lost fair and square by procedural means, right? So what can liberals do to, in some senses, repair this reputation that liberals fear democracy, deep democracy? There's a view out there. I mean, I had this conversation with somebody in Maine once, and I was kind of taken aback, who believed that the election was stolen, right? But behind that belief was an even deeper belief. It was easier for him to believe that the election was stolen, last election was stolen, because he said, look, the whole system is already stolen, right? That in some senses, the very institutions of democracy that we have, right, have systematically disempowered or not given full expression to the agency of lots of different groups. They just don't feel they can control their cultural world, their economic and social world. So how does one, in a sense, reinvigorate that democratic project beyond simply saying, there are some bad guys which we need to keep out? Because those sections that are disempowered don't trust liberals to actually empower them in their full democratic agency.
Well, we have a little over 2 minutes left
to
talk, and you are now introducing such a gigantic subject, which really gets into this bigger issue of human cognition. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, for liberalism is the premise, kind of the Enlightenment premise about the way that human beings process information. So we take in empirical information, we think about it, and we make inferences from our experience, and then it's a social activity, and so the information gets better and better, and we actually make progress. And I think that the last few years have certainly demonstrated to me that that is not the way the human mind works. I mean, I think Jonathan hate actually in the righteous mind describes an alternative process by which we start with the outcomes we want and we use our cognitive capacity to build an empirical case for why what we want is actually the truth. And when you add that to the internet, where basically anyone can say anything, and as Renee DiResta says in her new book, what's true is not what any expert says, but it's how many likes you get. You get this very toxic mixture where you can't convince people of things because they're simply immune to empirical information. And I have no idea how to solve that problem. I mean, I honestly don't. And I think that unless we do solve it, we're going to all be in deep trouble.
So the idea that somebody can say, I have no idea, is such a perfect example of liberal humility and the strength of liberalism that I think it's appropriate to end on that hopeful note and thank Francis for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah.